Despite the amount of work that it takes to make videos with reviews for more than one title, I enjoy doing it and it's a little more accessible. This video is Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. I already have great respect for The Dark Knight, but I haven't seen Batman Begins or The Dark Knight Rises for a very long time. First up, obviously, is Batman Begins. This is probably going to be one of the shorter reviews I've ever done, because there isn't a lot I can say about Batman Begins other than really fucking cool. The film really understands what makes a good action film and nails every opportunity to make its moments as cool as possible. The most admirable aspect of Batman Begins is how well it creates a realistic Batman. The villains, while somewhat out of the ordinary, are fairly grounded, and that's a fairly difficult thing to do when your hero is a man dressed as a bat. Part of the reason I think the villains work so well is because they are chosen as reflections of Bruce Wayne's character arc in the film. Christopher Nolan has said in interviews that there is a theme behind each of the Dark Knight films, and for Batman Begins it was fear. In doing this, the origin of Batman is not only more compelling, but I think the overall film was more cohesive and connected, and this helped to ground the film, and in some sense kept it from being overly cheesy or unintelligent. I'll be honest, in most contexts, the Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul's plan would be fairly dumb, but what it does is take a fairly generic villain plan and center it around the hero, Batman. Having not yet watched the other two films, I can't say for sure just yet, but I think what makes these films so good is the way they put an otherwise uninspired villain plot in new contexts. While Gotham is under threat in Batman Begins, the plot is more centered on Batman himself and how he would be impacted if he were unable to save the day. The film's plot is about Batman's morals, his code, and Bruce Wayne's transformation into Batman. While Batman is usually a straightforward and sometimes fairly boring character, the focus on Bruce Wayne's creation of the image of Batman is really quite interesting. He spends the movie debating his moral code, and although it may seem like a throwaway line, I think it's great that there was some discussion of the idea of Batman, and why he can achieve more as a symbol than as a man. In addition to this, the way the movie presents Bruce Wayne's guilt over the death of his parents and his fear of bats helped to make him a more vulnerable character than he would normally be, and it makes it easier to identify and relate to Bruce. Also, the two villains of Batman Begins attacked Bruce from two different directions. Scarecrow focused on overcoming his fears, and Ra's al Ghul focused on his moral code and his rule of not killing. The performances of these characters are pretty good. There isn't really a standout amazing performance, but the majority of the cast does well to bring their characters to life. The only really weak part of Batman Begins is its presentation. It's about the most bland looking of all Christopher Nolan's films. While I can't say that there's anything wrong with it, for a majority of the runtime it's just boring to look at. The framing is incredibly generic and uninspired, and the editing follows this a bit as well. It's edited the way any other movie of this kind would be edited, which is quickly to distract from fight choreography. Which is half decent in this film, but it could be slightly more realistic. Where Batman Begins really steps up is when Batman is taking down mob members one by one, as they all become a little bit more terrified. The film creates incredible slow-building tension, and watching Batman pop out from different objects and hiding places is really fun to watch. The score also has a keen understanding for making a moment as impactful as possible. I've always liked the music for the Dark Knight trilogy, but it works a lot better with the film than I remember. It's grand, and it builds up slowly for some truly majestic moments. Overall, a great introduction to Christopher Nolan's interpretation of the Batman and a great action crime film. Batman Begins...
8 out of 10.
The follow-up to Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, is widely regarded as the best superhero film of all time. I'm not exactly widely versed in superhero films, so I won't comment on that statement specifically, but I will admit The Dark Knight is an incredibly well-crafted film. The scenes that matter in this movie are nail-biting and perfectly executed. There are several sequences throughout The Dark Knight that I used to routinely watch out of context of the full film, simply because they were amazing scenes. Everything that Batman Begins did well, The Dark Knight seems to do a little better. Much like the story of Batman Begins, The Dark Knight focuses heavily on Batman and the villains, how they push him and how they help evolve the character. While the first film in the trilogy was more of an introduction to the way Batman operates, The Dark Knight focuses on the limitation of Batman's methods. The Joker was the perfect villain for the second film in this trilogy because he challenges Bruce Wayne not in a physical way, but in his ability to adapt his methods. The Batman in The Dark Knight is a Batman who thinks he has criminals figured out, and this is something that is discussed frequently throughout the film. Fortunately, this also makes Joker's plan a lot more interesting than Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul's from Batman Begins. The lack of obvious motivation for his character is what makes the Joker's actions surprising and his arc compelling. There is nothing that the audience can do to predict the next sequence of the film, and I think that this not only keeps the audience on their toes, but fleshes out the Joker's character. This can be seen by the lack of build-up to a predetermined third act climax like in any other superhero movie, and things like this keep the film fresh and original. What I think would have made The Dark Knight even better is to push Batman to become what he needs to be to stop the Joker. That is to say, he would need to kill the Joker. It would have been better this way because, as discussed throughout the film, this is the only way to truly stop him. It doesn't really make any sense to me that the Joker would be stopped without this happening. It's an evolution in Bruce Wayne's character and is another layer of tragedy in this film for this to happen. While Gotham City celebrates the fact that the Joker's rampage has finally come to an end, Bruce faces the fact that he broke his one rule. I'm going to beat the dead horse and say the acting in The Dark Knight is phenomenal. If you've heard anything about this movie, it's probably that Heath Ledger's performance is incredible. Heath Ledger's performance, the little details like makeup on his fingers, the voice, and the mysterious backstory make the Joker the best part of this film. I also think Christian Bale improves over his performance in Batman Begins, presenting a more vulnerable and broken Bruce Wayne. Some of the acting, and more specifically some of the dialogue, is also the reason The Dark Knight falls down a little bit. There are various lines throughout the film that are totally immersion breaking. It's a line that could be more passionately delivered, a weird accent break, or a strangely cliché line that breaks character. There aren't many of these moments, but there are enough that it's noticeable. The technical side of The Dark Knight is also much more interesting than its predecessor. Aspects of Batman Begins that were already great evolve in this film, like the score, and aspects that weren't as good are improved. The music retains the same basic structure in The Dark Knight as before, but there are some little tweaks that make it refreshing and change the tone and atmosphere slightly. Enough to separate it from Batman Begins, however the grandeur and majesty of the theme remains. The visuals are also, in my opinion, significantly improved. The IMAX sections of this film are all gorgeous to look at, and are used at all the right moments, although I would have preferred that the IMAX aspect ratio was used for the entire film. Overall, the cinematography is better in both aesthetic and impact. There are still several sequences through the film that are reminiscent of the more boring visuals of Batman Begins, but they are few. When it really matters, The Dark Knight absolutely nails it. The cinematography is tense, and the editing is meticulous and nail-biting. In combination with the incredible score, some of the scenes in The Dark Knight had my heart pounding through my chest. And although the movie isn't my overall favorite of all time, the triple assassination sequence is my favorite scene of all time. And that basically sums up my overall opinion of The Dark Knight. Some brilliant, perfectly executed scenes, in between some really solid other scenes.
The Dark Knight, 9 out of 10.
After the end of The Dark Knight, I know where I wanted Bruce Wayne's character to go, and for what reasons. And it seemed fairly obvious that this is the way it would go. However, what ended up happening isn't quite what I wanted, and I think this is the beginning of a few problems I have with The Dark Knight Rises. The overall direction of this film, I feel, is less cohesive and less focused than the previous two entries. What made the previous entries in this trilogy so great is kind of lost in The Dark Knight Rises. Less focus on Batman and his character, and a ton of plot holes that feel as though someone skipped corners for tension make this film really difficult to go back to, and makes it the weak link in an otherwise great trilogy. For me, The Dark Knight Rises falls down very quickly. The story of the film creates a large amount of questions that go completely unanswered, and this starts very early on in the story. Where previous films had villains that would have reason to know various things about Gotham, Bane knows so much about Bruce Wayne and Batman that it's hard to believe without being provided with a reason for this. It really breaks immersion for me that he, and numerous others, know Batman's identity without the audience ever being shown how that happened. The previous two films acknowledged that it was nearly impossible to find the identity of the Batman, and for some reason in The Dark Knight Rises, even a small-time cop knows Bruce Wayne's alter ego. While the villains in the other Dark Knight films focused on breaking Batman and pushing him to his breaking point, The Dark Knight Rises takes an already weak Batman and just exiles him. Bane doesn't really care for Batman any more than he does other obstacles to his plan. Bruce Wayne is just another barrier to break down and push through. This leaves the plot without the focus on Bruce, and the focus is what saved the story in Batman Begins. Besides the lack of focus that made the first two films so great, I think the movie moves just a little too quickly. It's too eager to reach the climax of the film, and despite an almost 3-hour runtime, The Dark Knight Rises still feels too fast. I think this heavily impacts the cohesiveness of the plot as well, and was the reason I felt like I was constantly out of the loop for what was happening. What helps The Dark Knight Rises along is its characters. After 3 movies of getting to know the team behind Batman, it's easy to relate to their conflicts and struggles as characters, particularly Alfred. One of the more powerful moments throughout the film is when Bruce decides to return as the Batman and Alfred attempts to stop him. Michael Caine's performance in this scene was emotional and overall really great, and this is one of several sequences that holds the film up. While the plot does fall down, for me the individual stories of various characters save the day and make the film interesting. Bruce Wayne's struggle to accept that he is no longer as strong as he used to be, Selina Kyle's attempts to start her life fresh, and Blake's journey from an idealistic cop to a detective. In addition to the various interesting subplots in The Dark Knight Rises, all the actors bring their A-game, which at this point in the trilogy is no surprise. The dialogue is also a lot more refined than the previous 2 films. Even more refined is the technical side of The Dark Knight Rises. Again, the music has evolved to change the tone of the film, and although some tracks are the next version of songs that were used in earlier films, there are several new tracks that reflect the new environments of the film and the themes that they carry as well. If there is one thing that stays incredibly consistent across all 3 of the Dark Knight films, it's Hans Zimmer's score, and I've been listening to it while writing all 3 of these reviews. In part because it helps to think about the film, and in part because it's just really good music. The cinematography is as impactful as The Dark Knight, but I think it overall looks a lot better for a larger majority of the time. The colours seem more refined, and the camera seems to be placed a lot more meticulously. It's a shame that the plot didn't provide as many opportunities for tense and exciting visuals as The Dark Knight did, because it could have made for some incredible sequences in this film that rivaled its predecessor. I will still admit that where it matters, mostly in the more emotional scenes of the film, the visuals are great. Despite being the weak link in the trilogy, it provides some great closure for the series, and I would still recommend checking it out. The Dark
Knight Rises. 7 out of 10.